This program is brought to you in part by the Royal Bank of Canada, serving Canadians for 126 years, one customer at a time.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of DNet, the Disability Network. I'm Ken Cavanaugh. This building went up and these steps. They represented an almost impossible obstacle for many people with disabilities. In fact, if you had a disability, you probably didn't work here. It would have been very difficult for you to even get inside. But thinking is changing, and people are trying to make buildings, services, society in general much more accessible. But these gains have been, and they continue to be, hard-won. They come from the efforts of people who fought long to overcome thinking that was rooted in beliefs that people with disabilities just weren't part of the mainstream. Today's program is going to look at a philosophy that enables changes to take place in our society, a philosophy that also enables people with disabilities to take advantage of rights and freedoms that have been denied them.
That black people have to sit in the back of the bus.
These are images that most of us recognize when we think of the fight for civil rights in the United States. This movement of the 60s expanded into the areas of free speech, the recognition of gay liberation, women's rights, and other causes. And these images were flashed around the world and into the public consciousness. These movements were revolutionary in concept and demanded a change in thinking that's still going on today as society recognizes and deals with prejudice. More recently, and closer to home, Canada has had its own movement as Aboriginal leaders strive to overcome centuries of discrimination.
I am here to make it clear to you that we are not inferior people.
These images, too, were flashed around the world. Yet, coming on the heels of these movements, there's another revolution taking place that also demands a change in thinking, a new approach. It's a movement that crosses all racial, gender, and religious barriers. It's a national and international movement, and this quiet revolution is focused on the rights and freedoms of people who have a disability. These people were, until recently, practically invisible. They represent a surprisingly large segment of the population. How large? Well, the number of people with disabilities in North America alone is greater than 45 million. To date, there hasn't been much violence in the fight for disability rights. Around the world, advocacy organizations have held demonstrations over issues such as public transit, housing, and access. Alongside political lobbying and advocacy organizations, another movement started in Berkeley, California in the early 70s. Out of the same conditions that gave rise to the disability rights movement, the independent living movement was born.
Are we going to perpetuate segregation?
One of the first leaders was Ed Roberts.
We're in process of making, I really believe, the most profound social revolution our society has ever seen. We take those people out of institutions, out of their nursing homes. We don't put people away and include people in every part of our lives and in our societies. We will have made the most profound social change. And that's my vision.
Ed Roberts' vision of the independent living movement empowers people with disabilities to examine choices, make their own decisions, and to take risks in order to direct and manage their own lives. The independent living movement quietly spread to Canada, and Henry Enns has been a major leader from the beginning.
The civil rights movement in the States basically framed the issues of black people in the context of violation of their rights. And the independent living movement is basically framing the issues of disabled people in the same context. In the mid-70s, there was no airport that was accessible. You would always have to be carried up and down the stairs. It was almost impossible to find a washroom that was accessible. You would go into churches and You know, they would have to lift you up to 10, 20, sometimes 30 steps. You know, and in most cities there were no accessible buses, there was no accessible curb cuts. So, you know, when you look at the situation for disabled people or the of disabled people before we started to talk about disability rights and independent living, it was very different from the situation that you see today. In the beginning, you know, I was kind of a voice in the wilderness, but very soon other people came on board, and we really started to develop a collective movement to promote independent living in Canada. I was working with the Mennonite Central Committee, so in Ontario, they applied for a grant to start the first independent living centre in Kitchener. Then I was also involved in starting the first centre here in Winnipeg, 1983-84. And for a number of years, you know, I had vigorous debates with Al and various other people about the role of independent living and independent living centres in Canada.
Al Simpson was one of those people that came on board early in Canada. Now he's managing director of the Independent Living Resource Centre in Winnipeg. Much of the energy and inspiration for other centres across Canada stems from the Winnipeg Centre.
There is a hub. It's a center of human growth. People with disabilities and their many friends from the community have come together in a unique planning center, research center, a response center. Its major purpose is individual growth, individual empowerment, taking control of your own life, taking risk.
One looks at the traditional rehab paradigm, which looks at professionals being the key role, the professionals diagnosing disabled people and then developing some kind of a treatment for disabled people, whereas in the independent living model, we're talking about disabled people coming together, identifying their own problems, developing their own responses, and basically seeing it as a human rights issue.
The mission statement states very clearly that an IL Centre shall promote, spread it out, enable, make it happen, the progressive process. IL isn't a static, fixed cure. It's a growth process. It's a never-ending development process where citizens with disabilities, and notice the mission statement calls it citizens first with disabilities, taking responsibility. Not asking for responsibility, not begging for responsibility, but taking responsibility for both the development, that's the creativity, and the management, controlling both personal and community resources. And that's what life's all about.
One could say Winnipeg has provided leadership not only in the disability movement, but in the women's movements, and the Native movements, and human rights movements. I think it has something to do with a fundamental structure and sense of community that exists in Winnipeg that has led to the development of a variety of movements, and in the disability movement you see that.
Yeah, and you hired your own staff? That's right.
You know, it's produced some very strong leadership. But always these leaders have brought a sense of community, that we can do it better as a community rather than one or two individuals fighting for themselves.
How are you? I'm very good, Shane. How are you? What we wanted to show is people taking charge of lives and being part of the whole community. As we struggled for an image, the concept of growth and creativity was born in the concept of a kite festival. The Winnipeg Family Kite Festival.
The Independent Living Resource Centre presents the first annual Winnipeg Family Kite Festival.
Start running! Run hard! Run!
It represented human growth, come together and reaching your height, your potentials. Creativity, design, brilliance, cultural sharing, partnerships, volunteerism, leadership. The idea of human skill with people with disabilities and people without disabilities. Coming together as a family, as a team. 5,000 people joined us at Winnipeg City Park on Father's Day to celebrate partnership, sharing, and having fun together. We had a chance as disabled people to give back to our community, to bring a new concept, and to integrate people at the same time. So it's not only win-win, it's win-win-win. Personal growth, community growth, and community awareness and fundraising at the same time.
Paula Saunders is with the Kitchener-Waterloo Area Independent Living Centre. It was the first one in Canada and has tailored independent living to a smaller city.
Too often, people with disabilities have things done for them rather than them doing it themselves. And with the independent living philosophy, I think you begin to feel better about yourself and are able to do a lot more than you were if you were constantly having people doing the things for you. One of the big things with our education and promotion is our Kids on the Block program, which is a puppet show that we take into the schools. We feel it's very important to reach children at this age because if we can answer all the questions that they have, hopefully we can get rid of some of the biases, some of the prejudices that are out there.
I was wondering,
question.
I'm so embarrassed.
Don't be embarrassed, Mel.
We've just celebrated our 15th anniversary. So we started in approximately 1981. Henry Enns was very instrumental in getting things going. And from there, the Independent Living Center, as it exists now, became a reality and has grown to a point where we now have 4 apartment projects. Shamrock is unique in its own design as far as being a co-op. Most co-ops have 1 or 2 accessible units in them, but Shamrock itself is entirely accessible. You can get into any of the townhouses as well as to all of the apartments. And I think that in that way it's unique, and offering the 24-hour attendance services program that we do offer allows people to move from institutions or from family homes into this type of a situation and live independently. They can form this small community and be able to visit anywhere and get along with their neighbors in their own homes rather than everyone having to come to them all the time.
Can I come in and talk with you for a minute?
Sure, of course. Come on in.
Virgil Gingrich lives at the Shamrock Complex.
Without the Independent Living Center, I'd probably still be in a chronic care hospital like Freeport.
Okay, Virg, is there anything else I can do for you?
I'm okay.
Okay, well, I'll see you later then.
It's much better this way. I can do what I want to do when I want to do it. I don't have to follow their strict rules.
Hello.
Hi,
Helen Renault also lives in the Shamrock Centre in Kitchener, Ontario.
My son, I think he feels more free too to come here to a place like this, and more at ease. At the institution, very seldom some, in fact. I'm scared that the government is going to be cutting some of the money that is allotted for the things like this. And then I really don't know what will happen to us. I suppose we'll have to go back in an institution if that happens. Which I don't like the idea of that.
Unlike large centres, Winnipeg, for instance, a big city with its existing infrastructure, or even Kitchener on a smaller scale, other independent living centres are servicing outlying areas.
Well, we should take the box out.
Yeah.
Catherine Bloomfield and her husband Jerry live outside Collingwood in the Ontario countryside. Catherine runs the Independent Living Centre in Collingwood.
We have rabbits and we have chickens. Not what you would call a full-size farm. It's more of a hobby kind of thing for us. The idea that people with disabilities need to be looked after is something that I guess I've fought most of my life. I've always felt that I wanted to have control, and that people with disabilities, if they have more control in their lives, are, 1, are happier, and 2, are healthier. And if people get jobs, they can put money back into the system instead of, taking money from the system. We started our center really out of people's needs, and I guess out of my need to see other people in the rural area learn more about independence, because I saw a lot of people being, dependent because services made them dependent a lot of times, and I preferred the independent living model without really knowing about that model until I learned about CALIC, which is the Canadian Association of Independent Living Centres, and I was quite surprised to discover that we'd been developing sort of on parallel lines to them, and we joined them in 1992. In a rural setting, people are more dependent sometimes, but there's a different attitude in a rural area of people supporting each other, and often you'll find neighbors coming in to help, and our neighbor across the road, he comes and blows our snow every morning, and it's just one of the things that it's been accepted as part of what works in our communities. Collingwood has a population of about 15,000, and it's also very tourist oriented, so there's a large influx of people who don't live there but come there on weekends or in the summer, and so we're working also with the tourist industry to promote accessibility. We have a parallel transit system in Collingwood that runs within the borders of Collingwood but not outside, and so all of the rural area, or even the small towns of Wasaga Beach and Stayner, have no transit system that is really accessible.
Everyone that's willing to sell tickets for the trek route.
With the cutbacks, people have been forced to be more creative, and out of creativity has come more push to independence. We've tried as much as possible to become more self-sufficient because we don't see the government dollars being there.
People with disabilities who want to live independently have made many gains since the early days of Ed Roberts in Berkeley and Henry Enns in Kitchener. 22 independent living centres have now been established across Canada, and there's still demand for more. But as government departments shrink and budgets are cut, what will be the consequences now for people who are living independently?
I suppose we'll have to go back in an institution, which I don't like the idea of that.
Tracy Walters is the current National Director of CALIC, the Canadian Association of Independent Living Centres.
Right now, with the federal government abandoning disability, we're going back into the medical model. No more community supports. They're taking money from community supports. People with disabilities are going back into hospitals. Medicalizing the disability and reinstitutionalizing people is down the road. It's going to cost us huge amounts of money, billions and billions of dollars. So I don't understand the attitude right now. I just don't. I never believed that we would come to this point in Canada, but we are witnessing it. In 1992, there was a conference called Independence 92. The federal government sponsored it, and 3,000 people with disabilities came to Canada. Canada was recognized as the world leader on disability. I was never so inspired. That's where a lot of leaders emerged. That's where the year that I became national director later that year. I was totally inspired. And then to believe that in 1996, we're fighting over basic rights. That's what's going on. I cannot believe in 4 years that this is happening in this country. Here we are having to explain why people with disabilities are citizens and should be treated as first-class citizens in this country. I can't believe it. I am shocked that Canada right now is not acting as a world leader. It is saying that disability is not an issue. My role, first and foremost, is to promote the development of independent living resource centers throughout Canada. So we provide services and supports that enable their process, their development process. So we assist them in, developing core programs and ensuring people with disabilities are participating at all times. We have tended this year to not necessarily focus totally on the development of independent living centers, but to focus on the global scene to ensure that the independent living movement is articulated at all times and that we strive to change the government's mind and attitudes and policy about this issue, because independent living and independent living resources will not be there if this attitude continues. Kalik has become more radical, like I said, out of survival. We've had to become this way. Before, we were just in the business of empowering people at the local level, and then when you look at the outside world and there's an avalanche, you've got to kind of stand up sometimes just to not be crushed. As an observer, I heard very loud and clear throughout this country that people with disabilities have had it, they've heard enough, they are fed up. There have been so many reports that have been shelved, that have been ignored, that they are at the end of their rope, and nobody has anything to lose right now, and they are ready. They are ready to show a public display of concern, discontentment. They're tired, and they're willing to walk right into an MP's office or right up to the House of Commons and just say, you're not going to go any further. You have gone enough. You have gone far enough.
So there comes a point in time when passion will have to overrule all reason in terms of creating change. And we may be in that situation now in Canadian society, where we're at the point where the opportunities are there, we've negotiated, we've done everything, and maybe disabled people have to resort to their frustration and to their passion in terms of creating change.
The independent living movement represents a philosophy of individual empowerment, and the independent living centers across the country are a testament to that work. But what should we do? Change back the hands of time? Go back to steps like these? Get rid of those ramps that have been so helpful to all of us, don't forget. To the disabled, yes, but to the seniors and to the public in general.
Our last words from Henry Enns.
I envision a world where there's equality, where people have the opportunity to participate, where there's a sense of fairness and justice in society, and where all people, including disabled people, have the opportunity to exercise their contribution to society.
To contact your closest independent living center, call 613-563-2581.
And that's our program. I'm Ken Kavanagh. We'll see you next week. In the meantime, if there's any subject you'd like to discuss with us, please contact our office.
Our address is Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W1E6.
This program is brought to you in part by the Royal Bank of Canada, serving Canadians for 126 years, one customer at a time.